Okay, so we've gone through the descriptive strategies, which basically just describe the phenomenon of interest. Talked about how maybe we could take that information that we got from description and see if we can correlate those variables and see if we can make predictions about behavior. Our final strategy for collecting data is going to be experimentation. And this is the only method that's going to allow us to establish cause and effect with any kind of certainty. All right, so experimentation is when we manipulate one factor to determine its effect. Okay, sorry, I just made a little noise at you guys. My little thumb drive thing is not working correctly. Okay, so still not working. Okay, so in experimentation, we have an independent variable that is the factor that we're going to be manipulating. So as the researcher, you're going to have an experimental group that experiences the independent variable, and then you're going to have a control group who doesn't experience the independent variable. Now, you use what we call random assignment to decide which group each participant is going to be in. Random assignment is when each participant has an equal chance of ending up in either the experimental or the control group. The purpose of random assignment is to make the groups roughly equal as far as pre-existing differences between people. You know, we all come to the experiment with varying skill sets, knowledge bases, levels of motivation, health status, all sorts of things that make us different from each other. And if we were to, let's say, be doing a study on memory, and we decided to give everybody a memory test and put all the high-achieving people in the experimental group and all the low-achieving people in the control group, that wouldn't be very meaningful, would it? Instead, if you use random assignment, you should end up with an equal number of high-achieving memory performers in each group and an equal number of low-achieving people in each group, so that roughly the experimental group and the control group will be the same before you start the experiment. That way, whatever you're doing to them with the independent variable will be the only explanation for why they performed differently. So if you can start out with roughly equivalent groups at the beginning, and then you do some kind of treatment to them, and then the experimental group scores differently from the control group, we can say with confidence it's because of what we did to them with the independent variable. Now, that measurement at the end is what we call the dependent variable. The dependent variable, your score on that dependent variable should depend on whether you were in the experimental group or the control group. So we do something to the experimental group and not to the control group, and we expect that to have an effect on some score, some measure, a memory test, a reaction time test, something like that. Okay, so those are the names of things. Now we're going to do a little example. And this is a legitimate study that was conducted originally in the 1970s, and then it was replicated about 2005-ish. Experimenters observe hand washing in a public restroom when the person thinks that they're alone or when there's another person using the bathroom. Now I put in there when the person thinks they're alone because they never really are alone, because there's one stall that is shut and locked, and on the outside of the door it says out of order, and inside that stall is the researcher who's going to be listening to hear whether they wash their hands or not. They're not infringing on their privacy any other way. This isn't an ethics question because the experimenter is not observing them while they're in their toilet stalls. The experimenter is purely listening to hear whether they wash their hands after using the toilet. And sometimes the participant thinks they're alone because they think that stall is empty, or they know that there's somebody else in the bathroom because somebody else came in and made noise and was using the bathroom and stuff like that. Okay, so in one condition, the person thinks that they're alone. In the other condition, the person knows someone else is there because they can hear them or see them. Okay, so in an in-person class, I would ask my students which variable is which, but it'll be a lot less mysterious for you guys because I'll just tell you. But first, let me outline the other thing. Some of the participants are going to be washing their hands, some are not, right? That's what we're going to be listening for as the experimenter that's hiding in the stall, right? So we've got some participants who think they're alone and some who know somebody else is there. And then we're going to count how many wash their hands and how many don't wash their hands. So now, all of you guys who can't reply, which one's the independent variable? Is it the stuff in purple or the stuff in blue? Oh, it's the stuff in purple. I tried to come up with a name that would sort of encompass that whole concept, like social setting, is someone else there, would be the independent variable. And the dependent variable is going to be whether you washed your hands or not. So the researcher is going to be in control of whether the participant thinks they're alone or someone else is there. In fact, the researcher would have a confederate. This is a good term for you to learn for later on when we talk about social psychology. A confederate is somebody who is part of the experiment and is behaving in ways that are, scripted by the experiment, but the participant thinks is another just person in the room, right? They don't realize that they're part of the experiment. So in this study, we would have the times when the participant thinks they're alone and the times when the confederate comes in and makes a bunch of noise and makes it really clear that that person's not alone. And then what we're going to count is how many people wash their hands or not. So the dependent variable, what the rate of hand washing should depend on whether you think you're alone or not. Well, just to freak you out and then leave with a slightly happier story, the 1970 data had, I always like to ask my in-person students, what percent of people do you think washed their hands when they thought they were alone? And my students always, think they're going really radical when they say, I don't know, half. Like, that would be horrible, half. It turns out 9% of people back in the 1970s washed their hands after using the bathroom when they thought they were alone. And when they knew somebody else was there, it jumped to 90% washed their hands when they knew somebody else was there. So the social setting really did matter back in the 1970s. There's a lot of pressure to wash your hands when somebody else was there and not a lot of pressure to wash your hands when there was not someone there. Kind of creepy. Now this study was replicated in, I think it was 2005. It was around the time that we had swine flu going around. And so they replicated the study. And in that scenario, the rate of hand washing when the participant thought they were alone was about 45%. And when they knew somebody else was there, it was still up at the 90%. So it's, 5 times greater rates of hand washing when people are alone than it had been, but it's still, not the world's greatest performance for a lot of people in the bathroom. It just goes to show you that maybe Howie Mandel is correct in not shaking hands with strangers because you don't know what they touched last. I had a student in my human sexuality class a number of quarters ago who gave me some hand sanitizing gel after I told this story as an example of experimental design in that class. And the label on it said, maybe you touched your genitals. That was the brand of hand sanitizer. I thought that was pretty hilarious until my college-age daughter has stolen it, and now I don't have it anymore because she thinks it's hilarious. But anyway, okay, so that's how independent variables and dependent variables are implemented. And of course, there would be random assignment of participants to condition. And so it's just randomly decided in this study whether the person thinks they're alone or the confederate comes in and makes it clear that there's someone else in the bathroom. So the purpose of the random assignment is to reduce any kind of confounds that might interfere with our ability to interpret the action of the independent variable on the thing that we're measuring, which is the dependent variable. Okay, well, hopefully that makes sense. And of course, the textbook explains this stuff in even greater detail, so you can always check that. In fact, I'd like to really encourage you to read your text. And of course, the learning curve games make that virtually required activity, but the textbook is really well written and really does a good job of explaining things. So get familiar with it. It's a really good book. Okay. Oh, I put labels on that and I forgot. Okay, so I'm done with chapter 1, so the next time I talk to you, it will be chapter 2.